And we can see some of them, they have the large bells behind them. And here in the midst of all this is a character who is dressed up as a bear, because the bear possesses the magical element. The bear goes into hibernation, okay? And then in the springtime reemerges to live again. So this is an example of a Basque festival that straddles the sacred and profane elements. But before we kind of drill down on the sacred and profane, I do want to encourage you cool cats. If you ever have a chance, and if you haven't already, to get to the Basque Country, or if you have, it's so much easier now to find out what's going on. Back in the day, it was pretty tough. You had to know someone who knew about it. But now this is broadcast everywhere. You can pick up, this is one such example, Ethno Travels. But literally every town in the Basque Country has its at least one, if not more, annual festivals. Most, not all, most of those festivals revolve around their patron saint. All right, so that's where many Basque festivals in the Basque Country tap into a sacred element. So again, the number of Basque festivals, it's not infinite, it's not endless, but it's something to experience. Many towns take great pride in this. Getxo, we just touched on this earlier. They take pride in having originated the Calimocho, so this now becomes a key part of how they go on to celebrate. So again, do take advantage of this if you have a chance to get to the Basque Country. There's great many resources now letting you know where to find those festivals. But the festivals aren't just for the Basque Country. These were key elements that were transplanted here in the Basque American community. This image, some of you might recognize, is from the annual Kern County Basque Club picnic in Bakersfield, California. They always celebrate over Memorial Day weekend. Unfortunately, this year, because of the COVID situation, it was canceled. But here is, of course, one example of many that we have of this Basque festival tradition that was now transplanted here to our diaspora community. And it's not just Bakersfield, California. You can find that throughout the Basque American diaspora. Again, another big one was scheduled to come up. One of the larger ones is the Elko Basque Festival. Unfortunately, that was canceled due to the COVID situation. Fresno is one of the earliest. And what I'm referencing are generally the summer festivals. There are Basque festivals, there are Basque events that dot the calendar throughout the year. But the summer festivals usually begin here. Generally, Fresno is one of the early kickoffs. And one of the latest is Chino, California. They have their festival during Labor Day weekend, that first Monday of September. Okay? That's generally the parameters of the festival season. So those of you who are clicking in, and if you weren't aware of this, if you're out and about, unfortunately, we can't get together for what would have been a huge Basque festival here in Boise. But High Aldi has been postponed and rescheduled now for 2021. All right, so we have hope. All right, so cool cats, don't get too disappointed. We will rally, because cats have 7 lives. All right, so we'll be able to live again. If you'd like, once this coronavirus haze hopefully dissipates, one great resource to find out about what's going on in the Basque American and the Basque Canadian communities is the North American Basque Organization's website. And you have that, if you weren't familiar with it, it's NA for North American Basque.eus. And there you have, unfortunately, as you can kind of see here, all of these events here in the short term have been canceled. We would have been in the midst of Nabo's Udaleku, a Basque culture camp for Basque youth ages 10 to 15. That would have been right now. It was set to be hosted by the Basque community in Utah, but because of coronavirus, that too had to be postponed. So unfortunately, we can't really live a lot of these Basque festivals now. So we're just going to drink our calimocho and talk about some of them. There you go. Now, we can't talk about, and we can't do justice to all of these festivals, but I did want to kind of lay that overarching overview of the title. To now focus specifically on the dynamic or the dimension we'll be looking at here in a bit more detail. And that's what I refer to sacred and profane. Now, with this, one source that we can reference is Emil Durkheim. He's considered by some as the founding father of sociology. And a big part of his work, he dealt with analyzing the role of religion in human society. And a useful element of analysis that he developed was this contrast between sacred and profane. Now, as he notes, all societies, to either a greater or lesser extent, but it's true, all societies, and for that matter, each individual. All right, so we do this individually, and then we do this collectively as a society or as a community. We create this distinction between something that we might consider to be sacred versus something that we might consider to be profane. So by his definition, when we see profane, he's not using this as a profanity. One takeoff on profane. All right, so relax, and this will stay PG because we're drinking. We're not going to delve into elements of profanity because if you know Basque, well, you can't cuss in Basque. You got to cuss in other languages, be it French, Spanish, or English, because the language was so pure that you had to bring in, if you will, those cuss words. And that was a slight exaggeration, but generally, that's the case. Most folks who, when they kind of get around to cussing in Basque, usually almost always will spin into Spanish, French, English, etc. But we're not going to be talking about profanity. So we're not looking at profane in necessarily a negative sense. I think what Durkheim is trying to establish for us is just the everyday things. Most of our daily existence is profane. The basic to-do list that we have in front of us. I know today, okay, I had to get X, Y, and Z covered. That's what we're referencing, if you will, when we talk about profane. It's the commonplace. It's the everyday things that we do, oftentimes without really reflecting about them. The profane is, are these things in our lives where oftentimes we're just kind of going through the motions. So that's the point of contrast with sacred. When we speak now on this side of the continuum, these are now a handful of elements in our lives that take on greater significance, or what I refer to, Durkheim refers to as sacred and profane with these definitions. Sacred we could identify, I think, as being the extraordinary, and then profane is the ordinary things in life. So based upon what Durkheim set in place, what he was able to establish with different analytical frameworks was something I think most of us have come to understand about the human condition. We possess as human beings the ability to create meaning and purpose. So sometimes this meaning and purpose can be given to us by our traditions, by our community, our society. But as individuals, we also possess the ability to create our own sense of meaning and purpose. So again, individually, we create sacred and profane moments in our own lives. And then we do that collectively as a community, as a society. Right? So there's a micro and macro implementation. But here we're going to be dealing more with kind of the macro, how society in general, and for our purposes, how Basque society goes about differentiating between sacred and profane elements in a festival. So again, for our purposes, when we're speaking about sacred, we're trying to identify the more extraordinary moments in our lives. Something that, as Durkheim pointed out, leaves us with a degree of awe. that leaves us with perhaps a moment of reverence. Okay, in contrast to now on the other end of the continuum, what we might consider to be more profane or ordinary everyday events. So by using this continuum, hopefully we can get away from this false dichotomy, wherein when we identify a Basque festival, okay, is it sacred or profane? Well, the answer is yes, or the answer could be no. Most Basque festivals possess elements of both. So it's not all one or all the other usually. It's, in most cases, a combination of both elements. Right? So instead, again, of this dichotomy that this Basque festival, this is completely sacred, and then this Basque festival is completely profane. What we want to keep in mind, therefore, are these various degrees, or this continuum. All right, so let's pop quiz it. All right, so I don't know if the determination's been made, all right, but for me, one of my favorite festivals of the year is the Basque Museum's annual Wine Fest. Now, here at the Wine Fest, usually in August, we definitely, this qualifies as a, no doubt as a Basque festival. Then the question we're trying to now address is using Emil Durkheim's framework. All right, is the Wine Fest, where is that on our continuum? Is this more of the ordinary or profane, or are there elements of the sacred, reverent, awe-inspiring? All right, so there's a lot of ways to approach this. And one way you could approach it is on an individual basis, see? Because one person there doing the Biribilketa, the march, we could ask one of those folks, so are you enjoying your time here at the Wine Fest? See, and for them, this is a sacred moment. See, because let's say, because for them, wine is a god. They love wine. See, because the person you were asking this, they're a foodie, right? So they love their food, they love their great wine, and they can't think of anything better than an event that you can go to and have dozens and dozens of people pour you wine. All right, so this is awe-inspiring. So you may find a good many individuals at the Basque Museum and Cultural Center's Wine Fest that consider that sacred. Okay? Whereas you could have that same conversation with someone else, and for them it would be more, well, profane. It's not necessarily a reverent moment. They don't necessarily consider this to be awe-inspiring. So again, we could approach this on an individual basis, but we want to try to apply more of a macro analysis. So let's use a second example, the San Ignacio Festival. Now, where is this on our continuum? Is this a festival that could be considered more sacred, or is this a festival that would be more profane? And again, there is a subjective element because it might well depend on the person you're talking to. Okay? But if you're familiar with the San Ignacio Festival here in Boise, usually the last weekend of July, again, in all years except our COVID year, there are elements of this festival that we could point to as, well, possessing a sacred element. Case in point, the name. Boise's festival is actually one of the very few in the Basque American community that actually uses a Basque saint's name. It's not the only one. The Basques of Buffalo, Wyoming, they gather in August and they celebrate the Feast of Mary. Okay? So Boise's not unique, but if you compare Boise and then Buffalo, okay, but most of our Basque American communities, it's just the Fresno Basque Picnic, okay, or the Kern County Basque Picnic, or the Homedale Chocoona, etc. So there is a sacred element, and it's included there in the name of Saint Ignatius of Loyola. So there are potentially sacred elements that could be identified there. But apart from the name, well, you wouldn't really get that from the images here. Those might well be more profane or everyday elements. So again, most of our Basque festivals possess different elements along that continuum. the sacred and profane. Now, there are some Basque festivals in the Basque Country as well as here that have more consistent elements that I think Durkheim would put in his column under sacred. So there are a handful of Basque Country celebrations that are commemorated, and again, in all years except for our COVID year this year. But here are a couple examples of the Feast of Corpus Christi. This is Latin for the body of Christ. Corpus Christi is a religious tradition that generally is celebrated mostly by Catholics. It's one of the points of distinction between Catholic and Protestant Christians. Many Protestant groups dispensed with the celebration of Corpus Christi. They considered it too Catholic, all right? So it went by the wayside, okay? But the celebration of Corpus Christi, there are two examples that we could point to, include the celebration in the Iparralde, the north side of the Basque Country. In Benafarroa, there's a handful of villages, and it's a handful, it's about a half a dozen. So until recently, unless you knew someone from there, or you knew someone who knew someone, you didn't know that any of these things existed. So Basque from outside of Guernica in Algorta, okay, had little or no idea that the Basques of these towns in Benafarroa were celebrating with this unique tradition, Bextaberi. Bextaberi is Basque for new festival. Well, that shows you how old Basques are. They call something that's several centuries old new. All right, so Bextaberi is a celebration from a handful of Basque towns, generally in Benafarroa, one from Lapurdi. And that's been transplanted here in the United States. There are bits of this that you can see if you go to the Kern County Festival. I know also Los Banos has incorporated parts of this. But the Chino Basque Club has made this a staple now for going on, what is it? I guess a couple of decades, what commemorates their annual Labor Day weekend festival. So this is done, Bextaberi, in the middle of a Basque Mass. So there are some Basque festivals that make it a point to include a very definitive sacred element with a Basque Mass. All right, so I noted the celebration in Chino. So Bextaberi is recreated and it's celebrated there at the beginning of the day with a Basque Mass. So it's clear if those folks who identify with being Christians, they know that Mass is at 10 or 10:30 and they'll come for that. But as most of us know, we got a good many Basques, they don't identify as being Christian anymore. Or they did, and they partied too much the night before, so they couldn't wake up for Sunday morning. Well, that happens too, a little too much calimocho. Okay? See, but there's a part of the Basque festival in Chino that has a definitive sacred element. Well, the same applies to Boise's Basque festival. A distinct set aside there is the Basque Mass to commemorate the feast of St. Ignatius of Loyola. And the transplanted Corpus Christi celebration we have in the second image here from Oñati. These dances were transplanted here in 1980. So the Boise San Ignacio Basque Festival has elements that could be identified in Durkheim's understanding of sacred, and then also profane elements. Okay, so I know that maybe for some people the chorizo is sacred. For them, it is awe-inspiring. They have reverential moments. But I think most Basques, they might like a good chorizo, but they don't have a transcendent metaphysical moment eating a chorizo at the Basque festival. So all of our festivals might well include, if you will, a mix of these. That Corpus Christi celebration that was recreated, was created in Benafarroa, is commemorated in Oñati, is something that continues to be celebrated throughout the Catholic world. Okay? So it's that Catholic world that we want to now further narrow our focus. So I had one idea that we could drill down on Corpus Christi, but when I was talking to Kylie, well, we got to pick our moments, because you told me where are we doing? Okay, I'm good on time. I'm watching it here, so we don't go over. I thought when Kylie asked me what we could present on, initially I thought, okay, we could do Corpus Christi, but that day had already passed. and those festivals, unfortunately, had to be suspended. So when trying to find a date, we settle upon this Wednesday. Lo and behold, perfect. So let's drill down now as an example of a Sacred and Profane Basque Festival. Today's feast of the St. John the Baptist. Because this, I think, is a great way to illustrate the fusion of sacred as well as profane elements. The feast of St. John the Baptist contains distinct profane elements. Profane that we'll look at, and it is a carryover of pre-Christian traditions. So before Christianity of 2,000 years ago, we know there were groups of people who worshiped the sun. So this was a big deal. The day with the greatest amount of daylight, the summer solstice. Okay? So we have definitive pre-Christian elements that we see, therefore, embedded in the feast of San Juan Eguna, or the feast of St. John the Baptist. But we also have sacred elements, because now we're not just talking or trying to have these awe-inspiring or reverential moments to the sun. This now becomes identified with a saint in the Roman Catholic Church. This saint, St. John the Baptist, we'll drill down in a moment, but in general terms, just for clarity, because I'm not going to presume that everyone who zoomed in identifies as being Catholic or is aware of the Catholic tradition of praying to saints. All right, so to make it clear, Catholics do not worship folks like St. John the Baptist or Mary or any other saint as a god. Only God is to be worshiped. Saints are prayed to by Catholics who ask them to intercede. So case in point, well-known Catholic prayers, the Hail Mary. And at the end of the Hail Mary, it concludes wherein the person who sang the prayer, and pray for us sinners now and at the hour of our death, amen. So built into the Hail Mary is the request that this is an attempt to ask Mary to intercede, to pray on our behalf. Because for Christians, death does not define the end. We believe that people, after they die, there is an afterlife. So hence, people who have died and gone on before us, they're still with us. So that's the Catholic tradition of saints. Again, so to underscore, Catholics do not worship saints as gods. Right, so this is not going to be, if you will, the case that we'll make with the celebration of St. John the Baptist. But it was June 24 that was taken as his feast day. But to provide, if you will, once again, because I don't want to assume too much, we have these 4 stations when it comes, if you will, to the earth and as it rotates around the sun. I'm just going to go with that because I believe that human beings have been to the moon, and it was not all staged on some studio. All right, because I think some of us, we've encountered people in our, who have told us, flat earth believers. We've never been to the moon, okay? So we're going to go with the best science that tells us the earth is what rotates around the sun. Now, as we rotate around the sun, we need to keep in mind a few things. One, our rotation is not perfect. The earth is a little crooked on its axis. So that's what also sets up, if you will, not just the 2 solstices, but the equinox. All right, so this takes approximately 365 days and 1 quarter. But it's not a fixed 1 quarter. It's not a fixed 0.25. So that's why this year, our summer solstice, that was supposed to usually fall on Sunday, this year it was a Sunday, on the 21st, was actually on a Saturday. See, because we always have to make these adjustments because the 365.255, it's not a fixed number. So over history, we've had to make adjustments, and I'll get to that in more detail here in a moment, including coming up with a new calendar, right? So this is going to set up the summer solstice generally is either June 20 or June 21, but today is the 24th, and this is the feast of St. John the Baptist. So how do we get off by these 3 or 4 days? So I'll touch on that in a moment, because a big part of it has to do with the change in calendars. But again, just stay big picture before we kind of get lost into the weeds. Long before Christianity, there's been the celebration of the sun. Especially as we know, as societies underwent a transition from hunting and gathering to agriculture. Those folks who have studied hunting and gathering societies, one of the things that they've been able to discern, a common denominator, is that in terms of their religion, they develop hunting and gathering gods. But then when you study societies that have undergone an agricultural revolution, there you have societies that have more of a focus on the worship of the sun, or a fertility goddess, the cult of the moon, etc. So we know long before Christianity, okay, this fascinated human beings. Not only just the power of the sun, which if you're in the Boise today, you really felt it. You know, we were it was hot, 90 some. So we know that all societies had an understanding of the power of the sun, and some of those looked to the sun as awe-inspiring. Some of these societies, therefore, developed a religion where they revered the sun. Okay? This image, incidentally, is Stonehenge, famous ruins in England. And one of the leading theories is this was developed as a form, if you will, of sun worship. At least that's one of the theories. To be honest, we don't really know definitively, because they didn't sit down and write why they did this. Kind of like the same with Basques. Why the Lauburu, the Basque cross? We don't know definitively. Basques who developed this didn't sit down and write and explain where the Lauburu came from, what does it mean for us. It's a tradition that was passed down by oral tradition. And over time, those traditions were transformed. Now, speaking of transformation, when it comes to these celebrations or moments of the Earth going around the sun, the winter solstice, okay, which is December 21, and note, Christmas is December 25, so we have a few days off. I'll come to that discrepancy again in a moment, okay? But the winter solstice is the day of the year with the least amount of sun. Okay. So Saturday, we have the greatest amount of daylight. So after Saturday, we lose approximately 1 minute of daylight all the way to December 21st. Okay. And then after the winter solstice, and again, that varies as well because we don't have a fixed 365.25. Okay. Then after that, we begin to pick up about a minute of daylight every day until this last Saturday. So the winter solstice, we know, was something that was commemorated by many early societies. And this is a portion of that has come to us today in the celebration of what many people refer to as the celebration of Christmas. Okay? Christmas has been pegged on December 25th, okay? Because on an old calendar, December 25th was the winter solstice. On our new calendar, it's not. All right, so that's why we have this 4-day discrepancy. But again, before the calendar, Christmas is a great example of a tradition that has been transformed, where elements have been adapted and now infused with new meaning. Okay? So one of the distinctive elements that many of us connect with Christmas is, of course, the Christmas tree, okay? The evergreen. It's almost certain there were no Christmas trees, let alone pine trees, in Bethlehem, where we are told that Christ was born. See, because that's not a tree that's very common in that part of the world. But pine trees were very common in Northern Europe. So as Christian missionaries moved from the Mediterranean world into Northern Europe, okay, they encountered peoples, therefore, that were already celebrating the winter as well as the summer solstice. And one of the key elements that marked the celebration of the winter solstice for these pre-Christian peoples okay, where what was sacred to them was the evergreen, because it was evergreen. It doesn't die. Northern Europe, like we have here in our part of the country, most everything dies during the winter. Hopefully most of those will then be reborn in the spring. See, but the evergreen remains living. So this was now crafted on to a Christian celebration. See, because how do you explain to someone that therefore Christ never dies? Well, it'll make sense to someone who doesn't know anything about Christianity or Judaism if you piggyback on the concept of the evergreen. All right, so that's an example that we had with winter solstice, with the celebration of Christmas. And it's not isolated. If you understand the history of Christianity, there are numerous examples where you see Christianity now having to be adapted to a different audience. Christianity in its place of birth, the common food staples included bread and wine. See, but bread and wine doesn't really work if you're in the rice part of China. All right, so you've had to make some adjustments as Christianity became a global religion. It had to adapt to different local customs and traditions. So Christianity adapted to the reverence, if you will, of the evergreen, what became for us the Christmas tree. And in parts of the world where bread and wine are not necessarily the staples, we see where Christianity has had to find ways to adjust to these common realities. That's the same thing that plays out now when we talk about the feast of St. John the Baptist. Okay, so we've got St. John the Baptist who's already in place 2,000 years ago. Okay, but long before John the Baptist exists, we have various peoples, including most of the people we believe of the Roman world, okay, many of who celebrated a version of the summer solstice, the day where we have the greatest amount of daylight. Okay. So this predates Christianity. All right, so I've alluded to it. The discrepancy that we have in the dates, because originally June 21, okay, June 24 was the summer solstice on the Julian calendar. This is named for Julius Caesar. Okay, Julius Caesar refashioned the Roman calendar because at that time they too had discovered that it was off. They had lost time. Okay, so by the time we reach the year 1582, Pope Gregory, okay, recommended that a change come in the Western calendar, because the 365.25 numbers had created, as you can see, a discrepancy of almost 11 days. So some, not all, okay, some communities took this recommendation. Others waited. It was belated. Some remained stubborn, kept their own calendar. It's one of the points of distinction between Orthodox Christians and Catholic Christians, which calendar we should be using. But it's the shift from the Julian to the Gregorian calendar that explains why we have this generally, in most cases, this 4-day difference. So what happened was, under the Julian calendar, in October of 1582, you went to sleep on the 4th, and you woke up on the 15th. Okay, that was the mechanism they used to get the calendar back on, because it just wasn't working. And this, remember, keep in mind, this was an agrarian society, people who were dependent on agriculture. All right, the calendar was off now already by 11 days, so they were trying to make this correction. Part of that correction helps to explain, therefore, why we have this difference in the calendar. All right, but now let's return to what Durkheim would refer to as kind of the sacred element that includes now this celebration of the feast of St. John the Baptist. I'm not going to read this because you can read this faster than I can say it, okay, to you, right? But succinctly, John, as we understand from Christian scripture, is the cousin of Jesus. And one of the things that distinguishes John when he begins his public ministry is his use of this water ritual of baptism. So much so that many people took to calling him John the Baptist. This became one of the key things that he was known for. Okay, he wasn't baptizing all the time. He was speaking about and doing other things, but it did definitely become, if you will, an identifying element. So much so that when Jesus begins his public ministry, he makes it a point to go and see his cousin and to ask his cousin John the Baptist to baptize him. Okay? Now, we are told in the Christian scripture that John says, what do you mean? I mean, who am I to baptize you? John was in on it. John knows that Jesus is the Messiah. He had been speaking about this. All right, so he tells Jesus, who am I to baptize you? You are the Messiah. But Jesus told him, no, we must do this. You must baptize me, because Jesus recognized the power of symbolism and ritual. And Jesus wanted to make sure that people understood that he was embracing his humanity, that he was embracing the human condition. And he institutes this as one of the 7 sacraments that the Catholic Church celebrates. Okay? So here we have John the Baptist, okay, who now is prominent in the early part of Jesus' public ministry. This is a celebration that has now gone global. Okay? This is the Philippines, the image here on the top right. Okay? This, meanwhile, is the feast of, the name of this painting is the Feast of St. John. And this is situated more so in Western Europe. Okay? So this celebration has gone global, okay, from its early origins. Before moving past St. John the Baptist, though, just a few points. We noted that he plays a key part in the early announcing Jesus' ministry. Traditionally, we believe it was 3 years that Jesus was amongst others as part of his ministry. Those of you who do know the story of St. John the Baptist, you know it doesn't end well. He wasn't just baptizing all the time. He was also challenging people to live better, sacred, holy lives. And that run afoul of, at the time, the monarch in the area, King Herod. He ended up insulting his new wife. Okay, his wife wouldn't have any of this. So there's this big festival, and the wife's daughter is dancing. King Herod loves the dancing so much, he promises the daughter, I will give you anything you wish. And that's when mom whispers into the daughter's ear, ask for the head of John the Baptist. King Herod, I guess, didn't want to lose face in front of his guests, reluctantly agreed, and that's what ended the life of John the Baptist. He is one of the early martyrs, therefore, for the Christian faith. And hence, that's part of the reason that he is commemorated by the Roman Catholic Church still today. Okay? So again, keep in mind that Christianity has a long tradition of taking pre-existing traditions and now recontextualizing those with a sacred element. All right, so we touched on briefly how this was done with Christmas. We see the same thing. Now we have the reverence, the awe-inspiring moment of the summer solstice, okay? And now we can reconnect with Corpus Christi once again. You'll see that all of these, they're called monstrances. What they all share in common is they look like what in the sky? You guessed it, the sun. All right, so here is an example that we see with the Feast of St. John, yet again, taking pre-existing traditions and now recontextualizing them. All right, so how do you do that with John the Baptist? With John the Baptist, keep in mind that we are going from the winter solstice where you have the least amount of daylight on, generally, it's December 21st, okay? But Christmas, again, is 25th, and the discrepancy was the change in calendars. Okay? All right, so you're picking up more and more daylight until this last Saturday where we had the day with the greatest amount of daylight. But then starting Sunday, daylight now was approximately about a minute decreasing each day. So here you tap into the symbolism of this. John's ministry predated that of Jesus of Nazareth. And John recognized, because he told his followers, now follow Jesus of Nazareth. My role was to prepare the way for him. And hence this phrase. He recognized that for Christ now, his moment had come to increase, to shine brightly, that it was his time now, if you will, to decrease. So we have, with the fusion of the summer solstice, the notion of now giving credence to Christ's ministry among people and the importance of the Christian message. Okay. Throughout the Basque Country, there were celebrations last night, usually on the eve of the Feast of St. John. Throughout the Basque Country, there are numerous bonfires. And that's why we have the images here of the bonfire. So again, real quick, so how do we get from baptism that uses water to all these bonfires, fire that commemorates the Feast of St. John the Baptist? Both fire and water are considered by most cultures as purifying elements. So in baptism, it's water that is now used as the symbolism of purification. And now you see, if you will, the transition from water to the use of bonfires that were already in place for many pre-Christian celebrations of the summer solstice. Okay? So again, this was crafted on to, if you will, profane elements were now fused, if you will, with new sacred definitions and explanations. This is just one of numerous examples. Okay. We're about out of time. So because of the time constraint, we could only really address the feast of St. John the Baptist and use that as now examples of a sacred and profane Basque festival. I want to thank all of you for tuning in on this. I see we got still 18 folks.
We do.
Who left their computers on, okay? So thanks for following the mantra to celebrate plus educate equals perpetuate. Thanks again to the Basque Museum and Cultural Center. And you Basque cool cats, I look forward to seeing you at our next Basque Festival where we can finally get together in person. All right, thank you. I'll stop.